Well, it's one of the greatest rivalries in sports, Duke and UNC. We're actually going back to January 18th, 1986. Why? It was opening night in the Dean Dome, at the time called the Student Activity Center. We're going to go back, watch that game, number 1 versus number 3, a classic Duke-UNC matchup, and some key players, some key off-the-court stuff happening as well, and plenty of takeaways from this matchup 28 years ago.
This is Distant Replay, the podcast that goes back in time to relive all the greatest events that we witnessed in sports. From upsets, to championships, to cultural moments, we discuss it all. Coming up on today's episode.
Welcome in a Distant Replay. I'm Ben George with Mike Noto, taking you back to Duke UNC 1986. And Mike, this was one that I put on the list because we're in the heart of March, right? Duke UNC, always the biggest matchup in college basketball. This one right in the heart of the Dean Smith, Coach K era as Duke was on the rise. And going back to this one was fun because for me, being around the Dean Smith Center all the time now, it's interesting to see how it moved and how it opened up and how all the drama, all the excitement, and all the ceremonies around that happened. But then the game itself was actually pretty good.
Yeah, this is a game, Ben, where 1986 Duke UNC. For someone like yourself who lives in the area, you have family who are alums of North Carolina. This is probably like a big game in the lore of that rivalry. But someone for me coming from the outside in, it was great to see just the pageantry involved with the opening of the Dean Dome and everything that surrounded it.
It's interesting because I don't think this game, when you hear the people talk about this game, fans on both sides, I don't think I've ever heard them mention this matchup. And it's not, I mean, it was a good matchup, good game. It was two undefeated teams in January, which is a big deal, 1 versus 3. I don't know why this one doesn't go down as like one of the big games, but I don't think I ever heard. I went back to actually find this game. It got on my radar because I think I went back to look to see when it opened up. I think I was doing some research on RJ Davis for one of the shorts we put on YouTube. And if you're on YouTube, please subscribe. I was like, oh, well, how long has this been open? When did it open? What was the first game? Come to find out, it was this Duke UNC big matchup. The weird thing was, too, Mike, opening in the middle of conference play, January 18th, a weird time to open a new arena.
Ben, I have in my notes, is opening an arena in the 18th game of the year weird? Like, I literally have that word for word written. I guess maybe it was delays in the construction is the only thing I can think of. But, yeah, it worked out where, hey, opening against Duke, and the game it ended up working out. But, yeah, puzzling.
Yeah, do you think that was one where they said, hey, let's save the opening for Duke? Or it was just, hey, the arena's finally open. I couldn't find anything on this, so I don't know. But the arena's finally open. Let's go ahead and roll it out. But it seems like a weird time because you're so used to playing in one arena and you're going to shift gears mid-season with a team that has championship hopes. It doesn't seem like it would work out in your favor necessarily.
Yeah, I think it's the latter, Ben, because like if we'll get into this later, but I'm pretty sure the scoreboard wasn't even set up yet. So I think it was probably the latter, if I had to guess.
Yeah, save that. We'll discuss that a little bit more as we go through. But we're going to break this all down. The broadcast, which was on ESPN, we're going to talk about the game itself, the players involved as well, plus some other guys in college basketball that year. They got some spotlight in this game. Appreciate you being here. Again, if you haven't subscribed on YouTube, please do that. We appreciate the support on the channel. Also, wherever you listen on podcasts, we're still throwing it up there as well. And follow along wherever you listen. So let's jump into this, Mike. 1986, again, January 18th. Now, a few things I want to get in off the top before we get into this, and I'm going to drop the link. You can watch this game in its entirety for yourself. Put that in the show notes. But I want to start off with just the pregame coverage because the great thing about this, it opens up with ESPN's coverage. Again, ESPN in its very early stages, Alan Massengale on our screen, front center to start us off, Mike. A little coverage from the studio, tossing out to a pregame hit with Marty Brenneman and Billy Cunningham. This took you back quite a bit, but really interesting to kind of watch this thing begin.
Yeah, you mentioned tossing it to Marty. We're talking about Marty Brenneman here, not Tom Brenneman.
Exactly.
So, his dad's also obviously more of a legendary announcer than Tom is. And Billy Cunningham, North Carolina legend, New York guy, I thought did a very good job on this game, which I'm sure we'll get to. Alan Massengale in the studio. We're getting right down to business here. There's no pregame fluff with 5 or 6 people previewing the game. We're going right from what is ever before this to a graphic, right to Alan Massengale giving us the pregame report.
They tossed it out too. I guess the guys were wearing tuxes because of opening night. Is that what you think was happening there, Mike? I was caught off guard by the black tie affair.
I was caught up, and they weren't the only ones wearing bow ties, which we'll get to in a little bit. But yeah, they had full-on tuxedo bow ties. Maybe they were told to because it was the opening of the arena, but a very curious choice for sure.
Well, in this pregame coverage, so it's interesting, and you could tell us early years of ESPN coverage, just the graphics, just the studio, maybe not the sharpest toss to the first billboard as the billboard's rolling over Massengale talking. But one thing that I thought was interesting was they hit on 2 college basketball stories at the top. I don't know why just 2. I don't know how they kind of squeeze this into like a 1-minute update per se, I guess, before tossing out to the game. But they hit on 2 players. Let's start off Tito Horford. Now, Massengale mentions Horford is still kind of in limbo trying to find a team in college basketball from Houston and LSU and talking about the teams that had turned him down. And with no context, Mike, just being thrown back into 1986, I had no idea what had happened with Horford, why he didn't have a team. Like, it was not a lot of detail in that report.
So, for those of you who are not aware, Tito Horford is the father of Al Horford, right? Al Horford's been in the NBA forever, was on those 2 Florida national championship teams. So that's who we're talking about here. And you're right. There was it piqued my interest. I'm like, oh, why? And we're talking huge schools that he got denied from, that he was once recruited by but got denied from. And you're right. Not to pour it on Massengale, but it looked like they basically, I don't know if it was fair to him, they told him like, hey, look, Alan, you got 45 seconds to, condense these 2 huge stories, to your audience. And it made it so he couldn't provide much context with anything regarding Horford.
And I went back and read his story. Do you know his story at all?
I don't. I don't know. Other than he's Al's dad, I don't.
Yeah, so I had to go back and figure out what was going on because, it piqued my interest. But he was from the Dominican Republic. He got recruited, got brought over when he was a younger kid to Houston. Somebody kind of recruited him there to go to high school there. Houston, he went to sign with Houston when they had a lot of promises. His family said they promised him. It was weird. The specifics were beef, like food, and like housing, like real specifics for someone that was from the Dominican. They promised his brother a job. Really, some weird things went down on signing day. They're supposed to fly his mom in for signing day. They never got her a plane ticket, and whoever was kind of watching over him was the co-signer for it, which was weird. Anyway, had a lot of back and forth, got uncomfortable there. Then Dale Brown had some issues with him because they were trying to recruit him and apparently did some things that were not proper by the NCAA regulations. Believe, if you can believe that or not, Mike, from college basketball in the 80s. Anyway, so he was going to go there, but then they had a conversation that, hey, if you speak about this guy coming down to see you in the Dominican, you're not going to be able to play. So he left there. He was just moving around constantly. Ended up, I think, at Miami. This story, the LA Times that I read, but he was also dating Al Horford's mom at the time, and they ended up. That was part of it too. They tried to move her somewhere. One of the schools didn't allow it, so she ended up moving to Washington. He went up there for a little bit. He was bouncing around a lot. It sounded like someone just who was, out of the Dominican, trying to find his way. And all these schools were seemed like taking advantage a little bit, right? A lot of promises, a lot of illegal benefits, impermissible benefits that were being offered to him just to try to land this guy. And this guy kind of bounced around, didn't have a lot of representation. Anyway, he ended up having his child, Al, during that year, I think. So very busy time during Tito's life, but just you hear those stories, and it's interesting because a lot of that stuff still happens today, right? It's oh, wow, these top schools are trying to pay players and give family benefits and blah, 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 blah. It's the tale as old as time.
That's very good background because, again, you got no context during the pregame, from Massengale. But it seems like from what you're describing, just the NCAA and these colleges kind of let Tito down.
Felt that way, yeah.
In an effort to try to get him to come play for them.
Yep.
Yeah, wow, that's good background.
Well, the other story too, Mike, Scotty Skiles, Michigan State guard at the time. I had no clue this guy was a rule breaker, but he was getting hit with marijuana possession. This was on top of a DUI earlier in the year.
Yeah, DUI, a weed misdemeanor, and we're talking about the same Scott Skiles that was the hard-nosed point guard on the, when Shaq first got to the Magic, became like one of those hardo disciplinarian coaches in the NBA. I had obviously known Scott Skiles as a player and a coach once he got to the pros, but I had no idea this background. And credit to Massengale here. He went into a lot more detail about what the issues were, and I was surprised. It's something I was not aware of.
Yeah, he was the first team All-American at Michigan State, had a great career. But, yeah, he actually got, while he was there, Mike, too, I don't know the timeline of these, but he also got hit with felony possession of cocaine charges as well. Those got dropped, and he pled guilty to the marijuana possession. So I think all that might have happened at the same time potentially, but yeah,
it's crazy.
Scotty was having a fun college career, sounded like.
You know what, Ben? I mean, you mentioned he's a first-team All-American, and I was wondering to myself, if a player did all this stuff this day and age, weed possession, drunk driving, the cocaine issues you just mentioned, I would imagine they would get kicked off the team. But, Judd Heathcote, coach at the time, probably looked the other way because he was so good. But, yeah, those are some serious issues he had.
Yeah, so that was the pregame coverage. Really interesting to watch. Again, you could watch that off the top. The link's there. It's interesting to kind of go back and be taken back in time to watch that. But let's jump into the game, Mike. So Duke and UNC. Duke is 3. UNC is 1 at the time of this matchup. Let's take a look at the lineups, which I think was interesting because there's some pretty good players. Obviously, some names I think you really think of, especially on the Duke side, for Coach K. These are like some of his core players, I think, that the foundation of what Duke would end up becoming was laid on.
When you hear any like Duke nerd talk about Duke history, like even if the kid is like, our age or younger, he'll always mention a lot of these guys that were on the Duke team, like he saw them play. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As the guys who set the foundation for Coach K. I mean, you must be surrounded by these guys who just, are just like opine about the old days of Coach K. I mean, I can't even imagine dealing with that day in and day out. But yeah, these are the names, right? Danny Ferry, Tommy Amaker, Johnny Dawkins, Mark Allery, and also Henderson, who had a very good game in this game in particular. But these, and also, of course, bench player on this team, maybe the most popular guy from this team at this point is Jay Billis. So, this is it's funny to hear Coach K referred to as young multiple times in this game, but this is the Duke team that we're talking about. And a team, honestly, all kidding aside, I get why Duke fans are romantic about a team like this because they were some really good players.
Yeah, and I didn't realize it either, but Quinn Snyder was also on this team, freshman on this team, who would go on to be a coach as well, and who is the head coach now of the Hawks, right? So he also a big part of this team. Didn't play in this game, but you could tell these are a lot of the core guys you look at for Duke too. So on the other side, UNC. Now this is right, post Jordan with this team, and you have Kenny Smith as kind of the headliner, but Brad Daugherty, two guys for UNC that really always come to mind too. I think for us, maybe because we grew up kind of following this era, so maybe it's more top of mind. But I still think those are two big UNC guys that anybody who thinks of the Tar Heels will think back to.
Yeah, even when you watch Brad Daugherty play in college, and we watched him play a lot in the pros with the Cavs, he just had such a unique skill set for a big man. Such a soft touch, was tough inside. He was just one of those guys, big guy who just knew how to play. Kind of think like a Tim Duncan type of guy.
I was going to say that too, yep.
Yeah, a very fundamentally sound. And Kenny Smith, I mean, he's the Jet for a reason, right? We saw glimpses of that in this game. And obviously he's gone on to be a superstar on TV, but he was a very good player as well.
Who else on this lineup, Mike, that caught your attention? Because those two guys were the two that you would know automatically. But the rest of this roster, unless you're a pretty big college basketball fan or UNC fan, you might not recognize a lot of the names.
Look, when they were doing the starting lineups, they announced the starting lineups, and the last guy for North Carolina, they said, senior Steve Hale, right? So This guy comes out with like A hairdo to die for. If you're like a lady in the mid-'80s and you see Steve Hale, you just must have swooned for Steve Hale. I have never heard of him before. Just based on his pregame introduction, I wanted to do a whole section of this podcast on Steve Hale. Never mind how we're going to get into how he ended up playing in the game. But a guy I had no idea about, okay, comes out of nowhere with that hairdo in pregame warm-ups. And I'll tell you what, I was hooked from then on.
Now, I went back and looked at Hale because, yeah, he had a heck of a game in this one. But he was one of the top players in Oklahoma coming out. He was part of what they call the greatest senior class in Oklahoma history, like in '83. Wayman Tisdale, Mark Price also become part of that class as well out of Oklahoma. So he was a big recruit out of high school. You might not know much about him because he didn't continue his career afterwards, but he played with Jordan, played with Sam Perkins, played with Doherty, played with Matt Doherty and Brad Daugherty as well. So he had, I mean, talk about a guy that had an incredible career. And you know what he's doing now? You probably have no idea, right?
No.
He left. He got drafted fourth round. Believe it or not, they had a bunch of rounds in the NBA at the time. He got drafted fourth round, but instead he went to Vermont and became a pediatrician. And he's been a pediatrician in Burlington, Vermont since the following years after that. Didn't go play NBA, went to Vermont.
Wait, so he's from Oklahoma.
Yep.
Which I'll be honest with you, I didn't realize Mark. Obviously, Wayman Tisdale was from Oklahoma because he went there and maybe the best player in their school's history, right? So I did not realize Mark Price was from Oklahoma, and he went to Georgia Tech. Steve Hale goes from Oklahoma to North Carolina and then says, you know where I want to spend the rest of my life and be a doctor? I want to spend it in Vermont. There's got to be a story there.
Yeah, moved to Vermont, became a pediatrician, and went on with his life. So talk about a guy that had a pretty nice life, I would imagine. That basketball career, knowing those guys, then being a pediatrician in Vermont, dude's probably living on the high life. Imagine what the property costs up there and like the cost of living, being a pediatrician. Probably just a happy dude, I would imagine.
I mean, look, how many pediatricians in Vermont can say, yeah, I played with Jordan, I played with Perkins, I played with Brad Daugherty, and it can have a life story like that. And he was a good player too. It's not like he was a bench warmer.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Jeff Lebo on this team as well. He obviously had been a head coach, is on the coaching staff now. His son actually plays at UNC currently. So some names there. I mean, there's 6 guys that ended up playing in the NBA, including Dave Popson and Steve Bucknall, who I am not very familiar with at all, Mike, but did have a cup of tea there as well. So those are the 2 lineups for this game. Obviously, Coach K you have on one side, Dean Smith, the legend, on the other. Now, the beginning of this game, a couple things stood out to me. I'm sure they stood out to you too. First off, as the arena opens up, it's going to be a big ceremonial thing, but they bring out a man in a wheelchair to do the ceremonial jump ball. Okay, it was Skipper Bowles. Now, fun fact, now the Dean Smith Center is on Skipper Bowles Drive. I did not know who Skipper Bowles was, didn't know why. I'd never really taken the time to think about it and actually look it up. But he led the fundraising for the Dean Dome. And so they brought him out, an older gentleman, as you can imagine, in a wheelchair to do a ceremonial jump ball. I don't remember a lot of ceremonial jump balls, Mike, in my time. But, do you remember many? Because this seemed a little interesting. It's not a baseball first pitch, right? Not a coin toss, but wheeling them out there, and the guy's like standing over the ball, acting like they're about to jump up and do the tip.
And the players are on the court when this is happening, too.
Right.
Like the 5 players for each team are on the court. We're talking like right before the ball gets tipped. This guy, they literally wheel the guy out because he's in a wheelchair, and you're like, what the heck is going on here, right? It just takes you by surprise. And then they go into a little bit of a background on who he was, and he was a big fundraiser. It starts to make sense, right? That's why they're wheeling the guy out. But again, just a bizarre scene because for the first like 10 or 15 seconds he's on the screen, there's no context to who's getting wheeled out, why he's getting wheeled out. He's there with a little kid who's his grandson. It was just one of those scenes from like the 1980s where it just made you chuckle at first, but then you get a little bit of a background and you understand. And now you're telling me there's a street named after the guy. It just shows the kind of influence that the guy had.
Yeah, he went to school there in the 30s, Mike, at UNC. So
of course, yeah.
and he did some insurance in Hartford, Connecticut, too, by the way. So Skipper Bowles. The other thing pregame too, the lineups. We have this now lineups are such a huge deal. Lights, video board show, smoke, mirrors, all this stuff. This is old school. Like, this is what I remember basketball, Mike. Alternating starting lineups. All right, now at guard, the 6'6" junior from so-and-so, blah. And then on the other side. And they each come out one at a time. I kind of miss those old school lineups.
The only time I believe they still do that, Ben, is at the Final Four.
Yeah, I was going to say, do they do it every round of the tournament? I can't remember. I know they do it in Final Four, but
they definitely do it at the Final Four. From Detroit, Michigan, number 4.
It has a
Chris
bigger
Webber,
feel to it to me.
Yeah, it makes it like, all right, let's get down to the basketball. It makes it's like a tradition. You expect it, and that was a good touch. I agree with you 100% there. And again, just with the level of players in this game, you were kind of intrigued. Who's the next guy going to be?
Yep. All right, let's get into the game itself then, Mike. A few things stand out to me again right away. So we're in an era, we talked about this before on the show, where there's not a running clock and a score on the screen at all times. You're left just to watch the game. There's barely even any replays. In fact, when they go to break, the technology isn't even there to show a replay going to break. They show the score on top of a still image going to break. So we're still way behind in technology compared to what we're used to today. But the thing that was very unique to me, and I don't remember when this transitioned out, but they had the manual scoreboard in the corner. So now, if you're a UNC fan now or you're familiar at all with UNC, it's where they come out of the tunnel, where the team comes out now and runs on the court. There in that corner, which would block that now, was a couple of people sitting there with the scores kind of the scoreboard that you would see in a pickup game in a high school or elementary, where they're flipping the numbers manually as the game goes along. I don't remember this being a thing in the 80s, Mike. You said this earlier, I think, that maybe the scoreboard just wasn't ready yet. Or was this a actual thing in the 80s? I do not remember this.
I never remember ever seeing. I've watched a lot of old games from the 80s. It's pretty much what we do on this podcast. And I never remember seeing that. Think about the scoreboard. Before there were little scoreboards to keep score of for like rec league games, this is how they used to do it.
Yeah.
For like rec league basketball games. They used to have those scores where someone had to manually flip it. And that caught me very much by surprise. And, you're talking about overall that not having the score bug constantly. What I found was it made me pay attention to the game more, because if you didn't, there's no having a game on in the background in this day and age.
Right.
Because if you're not glued to it, you lose the whole game flow. You don't know what the score is. You don't know what the time is.
Yep.
You're basically waiting there for them to pop up the score and the time.
Yeah, it's a completely different way to consume a game nowadays. But now into the actual game, the actual gameplay. So a few things I thought were interesting. We're not going to go through this, minute by minute, half by half. But I thought the first thing that really stood out to me was I thought Kenny Smith and Johnny Dawkins were two players that really popped off the screen, and mainly Johnny Dawkins. I thought the guy was super athletic. He's a guy that could play today, I think, and his game would still hold up really well. We've heard a lot about Johnny Dawkins, good coach still. I mean, he's very revered in the Duke circles. But watching him play, man, he was actually really exciting to watch and did a lot of cool things. Took a lot of shots, missed a number of shots in this game, but you could tell the athleticism was different than everybody else on the court.
So for me with college basketball, when Danny Ferry, he's a freshman in this game. When he was a senior, he's the first Duke good player that I remember. Okay. All right, because he was a senior right when I was like 9, 10 years old. He's the first guy I remember. But again, going back to all the Duke nerds, they talk about Johnny Dawkins like they saw him play. Okay, all of them. Even if they're like 20 years old. But I will tell you, I get it after watching this game, because he was fantastic. I mean, there's no other way to put it. I mean, you have all these players on the court. You have Doherty, future pro, Danny Ferry, Kenny Smith. And if you ask me, hey, who's the guy in this game? It would be Doherty, but Dawkins would be like 1A. If you ask me to rank the players in the game. He just jumped off the screen, plain and simple.
Yeah, he was a senior, averaged 20 points a game that year for Duke, and just a lot of fun to watch. And Kenny was the same way. I mean, the nickname the Jet, and we hear that now, but I unless you watched him play, you probably don't get that completely. But watching him play, you could tell he had a different gear than everybody else.
Yeah, even by like the mid '90s, like he was like when he was on those good Rockets teams with Elijah on, he was fast. But you really see in this game why he had the nickname the Jet. Just end to end, lightning.
Yeah, it was. And I guess being around guys like Steve Hell and Danny Ferry and the likes, he probably can get up and down a little bit quicker. But
no, I will not allow Steve Hale slander. So go in another direction, buddy.
Steve had an incredible game. I mean, and again, I could not find a box score for this game. It doesn't exist, which is wild to me, but I could not find a box score, so I don't know what he finished with. But he just was just a steady guy and just like a quiet, all of a sudden he's like, this guy's got more than 20 points in this game. How did he kind of sneak up and do that? But he was solid, made plays, and got buckets.
At one point he had 25 points, and they mentioned it was a career high. But he wasn't just scoring points. Steals, rebounds, deflections. He was incredible. I know you think we're overstating the Steve Hale effect, but if you go watch this game, it's going to jump out at you. Nice little lefty jump shot. The two teams in this game played a lot of zone. 2-3 zone for Duke, 3-2 zone for North Carolina, which was, again, with no three-point line here, you have to remember that there's different strategy involved in the game. But, Steve Hale I don't think I'm out of the realm to say he was the biggest reason that UNC played so well in this game.
This is now a Steve Hale Stan podcast, right? Is that what you're trying to tell me at this point?
I mean, we've never done an interview before, but he might have to be the first one.
Got to dig him out
if
in
you're
Vermont.
In Vermont and you know where Steve Hale is or what he's up to, put us in contact.
Let us know. Maybe he listens to the show. The other thing interesting too, Mike, with this Duke lineup, Jay Billis was coming off the bench, which was a new role for him this season, which he, I guess, kind of thrived in. I mean, Jay is one of the best in the business now, and one of the sharpest minds in college basketball. You could kind of tell he was, try to put this nicely, like pre-Duke exploding, right? He was a fine player, but you could tell why he ended up moving to the six-man role when Denny Ferry came in.
Yeah, so it's common. He got over-recruited. That's the term I would use.
Okay.
So the team is good, right? But this is right when Duke is becoming Duke, so they're able to attract maybe a little bit higher level of recruit, right? And that recruit ends up he plays Jay Billis's position, which is Danny Ferry. So Danny Ferry comes in as a freshman. It just makes Duke deeper, right? I mean, now they have Billis coming off the bench, and that's when maybe Duke goes from being, a top 10, 15 team to being a top 5 team, when they're able to get talent like Danny Ferry in the door. But I just thought it was funny that at one point in this game, Danny Ferry had 3 fouls with 9 minutes to go in the first half. And instead of putting Jay Billis in for like the next 2 or 3 minutes, he played with 3 fouls. I just thought that was funny.
Yeah, that's unheard of now too, right? I mean, you get 3 fouls, you're not playing at all the rest of that half, especially with that much time left. But that's kind of where they were in this game, and it's such a big game for both of them. But the other thing that stood out to me too, Mike, was the style of play. Again, no 3-point line. So there's a lot more the mid-range game and a lot more closer to the basket, but there's just the lack of spacing in this game compared to what we watched today, where you just have 3 and 4 guys around the perimeter and outside the 3-point line, was really interesting to watch because it was so packed in. These guys were trying to get to the elbow, trying to get into the paint, and you just had a completely different look of basketball than what you would see today.
It's very rare these days, but you had 2 teams, right, that were trying to get the best shot possible from as far in as they could the whole game. So it led to a lot of passing, a lot of good movement without the ball, but the byproduct of that was, since there's no incentive to shoot the ball from the outside, the defenses are more packed in, like you said, and it's so glaring when you're watching the game. I think it made it where, and remember, these are the number 1 and 3 teams in the nation. They're both undefeated. They have very good players. So I don't think this was the norm where every team executed like this, but everyone seemed on the court, from a perimeter player standpoint, had a pull-up jumper in their game, which is the most rare shot in basketball these days, just to show you the change, a comparison to this day and age.
You strike me as a guy that liked that style of basketball more than what we have today.
Yeah, I mean, I coached for a long time. You try to get kids to understand how important it is to share the ball and get the best possible shot. And when they go watch a game on TV, they're doing the opposite, right? They're just shooting the first good shot they get because it's an analytics thing, right? Mm-hmm. But younger kids, they're taking the first shot they get. They're only hitting 20% of them, So, but this style of basketball, if you're really trying to teach someone the right way to play, and the right way to get good shots every time down the court. Watch a game like this. I mean, it'll make your head spin.
Yeah, it will. So that I think was very interesting to go back, and if you're a fan of basketball and want to kind of see how the game's evolved, this is a good one to watch and compare to what we see today. What else from this game, Mike, did you take away?
Again, I mentioned it before, but the fact that both teams played a zone, right? The fact that the halftime stats were about as close as you could get. They showed a graphic of the halftime stats.
Mm-hmm.
Even though North Carolina was in the lead most of the game, Duke was Duke would come back, North Carolina would pull ahead. It was very much a nip and tuck game. What I thought was funny, Ben, is did you notice right when the ball tipped, you know how they show like the all-time series and what, how many games each team has won? They showed a graphic that said all-time series in the Dean Smith Center, and right under it said 0-0.
Yeah.
I thought that was funny.
That was great. So this game, again, kind of back and forth. Overall, did you think this was how would you rate this game going back and watching it? Because it ended up being a 95-92 final in this game. So really close game, back and forth, some, top players in this game. But like going back to actually rate it, like what would you say? What would you give it?
So I thought the pace was very good, especially for a game that had a lot of fouls. Usually when you have a lot of fouls, the pace of the game gets impacted. Very good pace of the game. I thought North Carolina was one of those games where you get a home team in college basketball. They kind of playing with a different juice, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And even though Duke, I mean, there were several points in this game where it could have been a complete blowout, but they kept on knifing into the lead. I thought it was a very solid regular season rivalry game, not a classic. There was no big moment. There was no Tyler Hansbrough getting his head split open or Jeff Capel's shot to win the game. There was nothing like that. So I could see why sometimes it doesn't get mentioned with the Duke, North Carolina legendary games. Mm-hmm. I thought it was a solid regular season game.
And 95-92, obviously a high scoring game, and that's even still high scoring today. This was without a 3-point line, but I went back and this UNC team before this, they had scored over 100 points 7 times in this season before this game. So this was a pretty common occurrence for the squad. They played fast. They shot at a high percentage, very efficient offense, clearly. But 95-92, pretty surprising to see that score that day and age, you would think. But this team scored a lot, quite a bit. And this even had a Coach K technical foul as well in this game.
Yeah, I mean, we've done different Duke games, and I've given my opinion on Coach K. I don't think in 1986, we're dealing with the phony Coach K that he became. Because remember, you're dealing with Coach K where they would make the Final Four in this season, but we're not dealing with like the vaunted Coach K. He doesn't have a national championship yet. Dean Smith is clearly the guy in this rivalry at this point. But yeah, more of a feisty underdog Coach K, which is not the guy you got later in his career.
So this game would end up 95-92. UNC would win. And just kind of looking through how this would play out for both squads. So UNC would go on. They get knocked out. Both of these teams got knocked out by Louisville in the postseason. Sweet 16 for UNC, lost to Louisville. Again, Denny Crum Louisville team with Kenny Payne, who just got fired as the head coach at Louisville. Purvis Ellison also on that team, most outstanding player. Duke lost to them in the championship game, 72-69 in that one. And a game in which LSU made the Final Four, or a year in which LSU made the Final Four as an 11 seed, Mike, in that one as well. But you could tell, again, this Duke team that won the ACC tournament, that made this deep run into the NCAA tournament all the way to the finals, losing to a very good Louisville team, was on the verge of breaking through, and they would pretty soon.
Yeah, I mean, this is really, if you don't like Duke, this is this is the time period where you can look back to and say, man, this is where everything turned, because in the coming decades they would become them and North Carolina, but especially Duke would become the preeminent program in college basketball for a while here. I think if you look at the history of both programs, North Carolina edges out Duke, but this is when the Duke that we know now, the Duke no one likes, the Duke that, the Cameron crazies, everything you associate with Duke, Krzyzewskiville, Dickie V going crazy about Duke, for 20 straight years. If you want to look to where it all started, it started with this group of guys.
Yeah, this Duke team would make the Final Four 3 straight years, 4 out of 5 years before winning back-to-back national championships. So Coach K still trying to figure it out, but eventually got it done. One other interesting fact from this, Mike, and I don't know, again, going back to the way this schedule was laid out with the opening of the arena, they beat Duke this Saturday, January 18th, 95-92. UNC played at Marquette on Sunday and won 66-64. Explain that. This was common, apparently, at the time to play Saturday and Sunday games. The following weekend, they played Saturday against Georgia Tech and Sunday against Notre Dame. Do you remember
student athletes, Ben?
Do you remember there being 2 games on the weekend like that?
Student athletes back then, Ben. Not athletes, students.
Back-to-back games, common.
Non-conference games. So
Yeah.
the Marquette game and the Notre Dame game were non-conference.
Yeah, independence.
Good teams too.
Yeah.
It's not. They're not. They're not. Those are not easy games back then. Marquette and Notre Dame.
No, not at all. So, thought that was interesting to see how that schedule played out as well. But any other final thoughts, Mike, from this 1986 opener inside the Dean Dome?
Not any more thoughts from this game, but I was looking a little bit into UNC's schedule. They lost in the I believe their first game of the ACC tournament to Maryland. That had to be the Len Bias team, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, because Bias was the first pick in the '86 draft.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just a little put a pin in on the era that we're in here, just to give some historical context.
Yeah, good era of college basketball, no question about it, especially in the ACC as well. So, really good game, a lot of fun to watch. Again, we'll drop it in the show notes. Check it out if you'd like, and at least watch the beginning. Watch the coverage from ESPN, early days of college basketball. Alan Massengale, Marty Brenneman, Billy Cunningham on the call. A lot of fun. Enjoyed going back to this one, Mike. As always, appreciate your support of the show. Please subscribe. If you listen this long, there's no reason why you shouldn't be subscribed to the channel. We appreciate it. And Mike will do it again soon.
Yeah, and this game is Jay Billis approved because there was no court storming.
Until next time.